The transfer of presidential power in the US can cost tens of millions of dollars. Between office space, security briefings, and background checks for new staff, incoming presidents have had to rely on both federal funds and private donors to foot the giant bill. But Donald Trump is the first leader in US history to decline federal funds for his transition.
He has several very wealthy donors that have more than enough money to pay for the things that their transition needs.
He's also refusing to sign government forms that would require him to disclose how much his donors gave.
No one is able to look at those donations and see, is this person getting a role in the administration? There's any number of things that they could influence Trump on.
So what are the costs associated with a presidential transition? And how could this one change future transfers of power?
The new occupant of the White House and his predecessor meet in a unique joint session. It's the culmination of one of the best-managed transitions between administrations in the nation's history.
Presidential transitions have always been complicated. And for almost 200 years, there weren't any laws governing them. Caitlin Aprisco covers money and politics for Politico.
Up until about the 1960s, presidential transitions were entirely privately funded.
John F. Kennedy defeated GOP standard-bearer Richard Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections on record.
The incoming president's political party would usually foot the bill for those expenses.
For example, in 1960, John F. Kennedy's transition was partly funded by the Democratic National Committee, or DNC. That was standard practice at the time. But in 1963, Congress decided to streamline the process and came up with the Presidential Transition Act.
That allowed presidents-elect to access federal funding and federal resources for their transitions, obviously with the caveat that, when you bring in those federal funds, you have a limit on them and you have to disclose them.
By law, every election year, the sitting president needs to propose a budget for the transition. Congress then has to approve it, earmark that money, and hand it over to the General Services Administration, or GSA.
The General Services Administration is the government agency that supports the basic functions of government, and it also oversees the presidential transition.
It's an independent body, which means it isn't connected to either political side, and keeps track of all the transition funds, spending them on things like phones and computers, and making sure they're secure so no one can steal data, which could compromise national security. The agency pays expenses for the outgoing administration during the transition process. It also provides office space in one of roughly 8,000 government buildings and furnishes it. In fact, President Harry Truman, who created the GSA back in 1949, made its first task renovating the White House after a piano fell through the floor.
Reconstruction was undertaken because architects called the building unsafe.
But since then, critics have accused the agency of wasteful spending, like when it allegedly used over $800,000 to send government staff to Las Vegas during the Obama administration. The GSA even has a fleet of over 200,000 cars it vets for safety. It leases them out for new and existing staff. It trains incoming staff too, which is an important part of every transition, especially if they've never worked in government.
When the president-elect nominates people for their cabinet, the GSA is normally the agency that will conduct the background checks on that.
But all that federal support comes with terms and conditions that candidates have to agree to when they sign the GSA documents, usually before the election even happens.
If you sign the GSA paperwork to accept federal funding and federal help, the GSA caps private donations at $5,000 per donor. Donors don't just have to be a person, they could be a company or another organization. It does also prohibit donations from foreign nationals. Beyond that, incoming administrations can add even more voluntary restrictions, like the Biden transition did not accept donations from fossil fuel companies, lobbyists, registered foreign agents.
Every president since the enactment of the Presidential Transition Act has signed the GSA documents. which also allows transition teams to use donor funds if the federal money runs out. Because it usually does. In 2000, the Clinton-Bush transition got $5.3 million from the federal government and raised another $3 million to supplement it. The Bush to Obama transition got $8.5 million in 2008 and raised $6.7 million to pay for the rest. In 2016, Trump signed the GSA documents too, so his transition got $9.9 million from the federal government. But the donations he disclosed that year as part of the GSA's terms raised some eyebrows.
Trump's first transition in 2016 and 2017 raised $6.5 million from private donors. Some of that spending sparked some accusations that Trump was using that money to line his own pockets because his transition disclosed spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on rent payments when a lot of the transition was based in Trump Tower in New York City, which is a building that Trump owns and gets profits on.
Another point of concern was what his donors were getting in return.
Several of the donors to Trump's first transition were later named to his cabinet. That includes Betsy DeVos, who is the education secretary.
Betsy DeVos's family sent 10 individual checks, each for $5,000, the GSA's cap. Steve Mnuchin's family sent money too.
His brother donated to the transition, and Steve Mnuchin was named Treasury Secretary.
Only one of the donors to Biden's transition in 2020 was given a cabinet seat, Dr. Arati Pargbakar, the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, who sent $500. But despite concerns, the government hasn't raised the federal transition budget enough to help reduce the need for private donations. In fact, they've only become more important. In 2020, Biden got $9.9 million in federal funds for his transition. That may seem like a lot, but GSA disclosures show it spent $1 million just training incoming staff and briefing them. It spent another $6 million issuing its contracts, $250,000 on office space and furniture, and another roughly $15,000 on office supplies. All that is pretty standard. The money adds up fast, especially that year.
They were in the middle of a pandemic. They, had a lot of health concerns that they wanted to be wary of, and so that needed extra money.
At the time, the GSA couldn't offer support until it certified a winner, which happened on November 23rd.
Meaning that the Biden transition wasn't able to access federal resources, including intelligence briefings or just office space.
The delay meant the Biden team ended up raising $22 million in private donations, so it could start working. To prepare for 2024, Congress updated the Presidential Transition Act to make sure both candidates could access funding quickly if an election took longer to call. It allocated $10.4 million in federal money to this year's transition. To access those funds, both candidates were asked to submit an ethics plan by October 1st, saying how they would handle conflicts of interest. The agency needs time to review it, so it's ready to release funding and resources to either team should they win.
Kamala Harris's team did that, but Trump's did not, which sparked some questions about whether he would.
He missed the deadline, but turned it in November, writing that his team wouldn't accept money from foreign agents or lobbyists. But in a statement, his team also said that it would not take federal funds to save taxpayer dollars, or sign the GSA documents.
Trump has several very wealthy people in his inner circle, including Elon Musk, the Tesla CEO, and Howard Lutnick, the transition co-chair, and Cantor Fitzgerald CEO.
We must elect Donald J. Trump president.
And even if Trump were to not receive any federal funding for his transition, those two men or any of the other very wealthy donors that he surrounds himself with have more than enough money to kind of pick up that slack. It obviously raises the ethical question of whether that would buy them outsized influence in a Trump administration. They could have more influence over cabinet picks or other appointees in the administration, policy changes or policy priorities.
In a statement on November 26th, Trump's team said it would eventually disclose its list of donors for 2024. But without a signature on the GSA documents, the $5,000 cap goes out the window. He also doesn't have to say how much each donor gave.
No one is able to look at those donations and see, is this person getting a role in the administration?
The incoming president has already named wealthy donors to his campaign, like Howard Lutnick to his cabinet, as well as Linda McMahon, who gave more than $21 million to Trump's re-election bid, and Scott Bessent, who donated over $600,000. Trump also promised billionaire Elon Musk a seat in his administration.
This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
We don't know yet whether the Tesla CEO is donating to Trump's transition fund, but the money someone like Musk could bring to the table, and the fact that we may never know just how much he did, could change the game for every future transfer of power.
One thing that could come out of this is you could see government watchdog groups and transparency advocates pushing for greater disclosure into transition funding and spending, regardless of whether the candidate signs the GSA memorandum.